Hello and welcome to my YouTube tutorials. This is my first ever effort, so you'll have to bear with me. Just a couple of little practical details. You can work through the PowerPoint tutorial on YouTube, take notes as you're doing it. There will be some activities on the PowerPoint that you'll need time to work on. Just pause the tutorial and then when you're ready you can restart it. There will be some Word documents that will go onto Teams that you can download before you start this tutorial. So before you go any further, just make sure that you have had that downloaded. This is a very new YouTube channel, so I am on YouTube now as Mrs. AB Literature, and to find me, you just look out for the flowers. Okay, today's lesson we are starting to build our response to two unseen poems from different times. We're looking at two poems, the Renaissance and the Postmodern, and I'm just going to take you through how to answer an exam response in a step-by-step way. Obviously, as you get used to those steps, this process will become much quicker. Just before we start, a quick recap question on the representation of love. So if you can just have a look at that now, we're asking, to what extent do you think the representation of love in the 21st century is different, I suppose, to the 17th century? For an extension there, think in terms of postmodern poetry. So move on into that 21st century. How do you think the forms of poetry might be different to actually give meaning to representations of modern love? Obviously, to do that, just pause the video and continue when you're ready. Okay, our question today is this. You will need to refer to the two poems. The question is, it has been said that Donne's poem shows the pain of rejection, whereas Larkin's is about love failing to live up to expectations. Compare and contrast the presentation of love in the following poems in light of this comment. Now, you'll see that on a lot of my PowerPoint slides, my house style here is a bright yellow box, which is your step-by-step guide. So whenever we are working with just the processes to answering, look for that yellow box and that will be on the step that you're on. So to start with then, starting point should always be look at that question and highlight the keywords in the question and annotate with your thinking about the representation of love. What I would suggest you do here is you should have it on your handout, or you can write this out on your notebook. And highlight any keywords that you think are important. Once you've done that, look at the time frames. So when was Donne writing? When was Larkin writing? What do you know about these poets? Anything at all that you can sort of pick up about these poems or these poets and when they were writing. Do a quick spot check. If you've got your anthologies, you can have a look through those and see if either of these poets occur within those anthologies. Once again, stop this video if you need to and restart when you're ready. So I thought what I would do is just go through how I might annotate this poem. Hopefully the PowerPoint will work and my animations will work, but we'll see how we go. So I'm still on that starting point, which is reading and highlighting. So this is what I picked out from this exam question. So first of all, just thinking about the different ideas of love across time. So Donne was writing a lot earlier than Larkin. So the thing that we need to be focusing on is Donne's poem. Is it really about the pain of rejection? And is Larkin about love failing to live up to expectations? Of course, at the moment, you haven't actually read the poems, so you will be filling in gaps later. But it is absolutely vital that you do take stock of the exam question, so that when you read the poems, you're reading them with a view to answering that argument. So it's worth just spending some time assimilating and thinking about what the question's asking you to do. Okay, so some things that I thought. Well, first of all, Donne. What do we know about Donne? We know that he was writing in the 16th, probably more likely the 17th century, and that in our own anthology, he wrote The Flea. So we've already got some information about Donne if he turns up in this unseen poetry question. So what we're now looking at is, well, what have we learned from our previous studies on Donne? The first thing is that the Flea has a metaphysical conceit. It is a metaphysical poem. There's an element there of carpe diem, seize the day. He's looking to take advantage of a moment where he can perhaps have sexual relations with this unnamed woman. We've also got a one-sided argument. Arguably, you could say it's a syllogism. But certainly this one-sided argument where the woman doesn't actually speak and he's the one that's giving his argument about whether they should actually make love or not. Larkin obviously is our modern poet, so we'll look at Larkin in a moment. The question here says that it has been said that. So what we're after, what the examiners are after here is your response to that opinion. So you could turn this statement into a question. You know, is Donne's poem about the pain of rejection? Is Larkin's about love failing to live up to expectations? And as you're reading the poems in a moment, you'll be able to look at those and see whether that is something that you can agree with or not. So a little bit of information about Larkin there. His writing, I guess you would argue, is probably early postmodern. He writes about the realities of the 20th century life, maybe a little bit about love, in terms of showing that the attitudes to love have been changing over the centuries, that nowadays we don't feel that it's bad not to love for our entire lives, for example. Modern society would argue that it is okay to fall out of love, and that love isn't forever. There is a theory by somebody called Giddens, he's a postmodernist, which is called confluent love, which is basically the idea that love is intense, that when we experience love as a modern society, we experience that intensity of love, but that as that intensity perhaps dies down a little bit, then people tend to leave it behind and move on. So our understanding of love has changed. There's lots and lots of criticisms of modern love that suggest that we are a society for the here and now. We want immediate gratification, and this certainly sort of fits with the idea, this kind of theme of love in poetry, that sometimes the love that we experience here is something that's very, very intense, and that in modern times, that is the way that we work with it. Love is less about this idea of perhaps longevity that you might get in something like Sonnet 116 by Shakespeare. Okay, so do ask that question, has love changed over time? In the exam, if you get two poets that are closer together, obviously that question will change slightly, and you'll need to look at the context of the poems and the poets to be able to answer that question. Okay, finally, I suppose, take a historicist viewpoint. Have you included all the AOs? Now, you probably haven't at the moment because we haven't actually read the poems, but just bear those AOs in mind as you start the processes to analysing and annotating these poems. And finally, those command words there, compare and contrast the presentation of, appears pretty much all the time in these questions. So you are looking at how love is presented in these two poems and how it differs or how it's similar, but obviously building that argument up. Okay, so the next stage is to read the poem. Obviously, you haven't done that yet. I always get students to really start easy. Read the poem. Don't worry about what you don't know. It's my motto. Worry about what you get out of it. If you've read the question beforehand, the poem becomes a little bit more easy to read in a focused way. So again, I'm just going to flick back to that. We are looking at, in Donne's poem, we're looking at, does it reflect the pain of rejection? Okay, so I'll read it to you, and then it is probably worth your while just reading it again so that you can answer those W questions. And obviously at that point you can pause the tutorial. The apparition. When by thy scorn, O murderess, I am dead, and thou thinkest thee free from all solicitation from me, then shall my ghost come to thy bed, and thee, feigned vestal, in worse arms shall see. Then thy sick taper will begin to wink, and he, whose thou art then, being tired before, will, if thou stir or pinch to wake him, think thou callest for more, and in false sleep will from thee shrink, and then, poor aspen wretch, neglected thou bathed in a cold quicksilver sweat, wilt lie a verier ghost than I. What I will say, I will not tell thee now, lest that preserve thee, and since my love is spent, I had rather thou shouldst painfully repent, than by my threatenings rest still innocent. Okay, so just take some time now to think about the speaker, who is speaking, one of our W questions there, and his feelings, or, what kind of tone and feelings come through that poetic voice, that persona. If you can't answer all of the W questions, it really doesn't matter. The why is pretty important. So why do you think John Donne is writing this poem? What is the message that might come out of it? Okay, so at this moment you'll want to pause the tutorial, just have another read and start your annotations by answering those W questions. Okay, so the next poem, poem B, is Wild Oats by Larkin. Again, we're still thinking about the W questions. If somebody said to me, I've been teaching 20 odd years, so if somebody said to me, oh, Mrs. Brown, just, tell me what this poem is about, without really reading it and immersing myself in it, I wouldn't be able to do it. So it is really important to get to know these poems. Now, it's worth just flicking back to that title again, which I'm going to do, so that before we read it, we know what the question is about, remembering that the Donne's poem, the claim is that it's about the pain of rejection. So what is Wild Oats about, according to the statement? We are looking at how is Larkin's poem about love failing to live up to expectations. Okay. So again, I'll read the poem to you, and then you can pause the tutorial to give yourselves time to annotate according to those W questions. Wild Oats. About 20 years ago, two girls came in where I worked. A bosomy English rose and a friend in specs I could talk to. Faces in those days sparked the whole shooting match off, and I doubt if ever one had like hers. But it was the friend I took out, and in 7 years after that wrote over 400 letters, gave a 10-guinea ring. I got back in the end, and met at numerous cathedral cities unknown to the clergy. I believe I met Beautiful twice. She was trying both times, so I thought, not to laugh. Parting, after about 5 rehearsals, was an agreement that I was too selfish, withdrawn, and easily bored to love. Well, useful to get that learnt. In my wallet are still 2 snaps of bosomy rose with fur gloves on. unlucky charms, perhaps. Okay, so a very different poem here. And again, it feels much more modern. And I think that's important to note. Obviously, we are thinking in terms of a historicist approach to these unseen poems. So let's just sort of focus on actually how stylistically they're different. And in terms of the representation of love as well, how different is that? So again, I'll just pause the tutorial, give yourselves a few minutes to reread the poem and answer those W questions, paying particular attention to the why. What message is Larkin giving us about the nature of mid-20th century, mid to late 20th century love? Okay. So we're now moving on to, it seems like we've been going forever, but we're on the sort of the third step. I actually call it step 2, which is looking at the title of the poem. So many students just miss this out. They just move on to the poem and then they panic and end up sort of feature spotting bits of the language features in there. You can see that I've done an awful lot of work before we start looking at the writer's choice of sort of language, their methods that they use to convey their ideas. We will come to that, but it is about getting that bigger picture and making sure that we are immersing ourselves in the poems as we go before we start looking at the language features. Otherwise, it just ends up with you picking out the simile here or a metaphor there or a caesura here and not really engaging in what those meanings are. So we do have two very different poems. And if we look at these titles, we can tell an awful lot about them. Incidentally, some poems don't have titles, and then it's a little bit more difficult. So what brings to mind is a lot of E. Cummings' poetry from the mid-20th century, mid to late 20th century, they don't have titles. And Simon Armitage, his Book of Matches, doesn't either. But we may well come to one of those poems later on in the series. Okay, so John Donne here, writing in 1633, calls his poem The Apparition. Quite a difficult word in terms of meaning. An apparition is a synonym, that's another word for a ghost. And we can see the references to the ghost as we read the poem. So again, the use there, it says, a verier ghost than I. And poor Aspen wretch. Aspen means very, very, very pale. So there's quite a lot of references to ghosts here. What's the point of this? What's the message? Well, the speaker here is saying, you've killed me by spurning me, by turning me away, but I won't leave it there. I'm going to come back and haunt you. And when I do, you might be in the arms of somebody else, but I'm gonna haunt you anyway. And just rest assured that you will never get away from me. It's really, really quite bitter. Wild Oats is very different. There's certain connotations to the title here. Sort of a modern idiomatic phrase is it kind of refers to that idea of wild oats. The phrase is, I'm sowing my wild oats. Which somebody may say if they feel that they're going to look around for love and perhaps sleep around a little bit before they settle down. Actually, back in sort of Victorian times and pre-Victorian times, it was actually the done thing for some people, men to sow their wild oats, to go and do a grand tour and to experience love before they settle down. So wild oats there is referring not just about sort of wildness, it is actually about who do I settle down with, and that question with who I settle with before and who do I actually experiment or experience love with before I settle down. Okay, so there are some connotations. You may well, in your own research, find some more. Often titles do employ polysemy. Polysemy is the technical word for more than one meaning, so ambiguity or ambiguous meanings. And it's worth just exploring that before you move on to annotating the rest of the poem. Okay, number 3 then in my yellow box here is exploring the context. We know that in most A-level specifications, you need to apply a historical approach to the text that you study. At this stage, obviously, it is quite good to have a look a little bit about sort of what Donne was writing about, and maybe look at the historical context. Think about what other people were writing at the time. So, who was contemporary with John Donne, for example? So Shakespeare was partly contemporary with him, but other poets will have been as well, who you will have come across before. And it's worth just making a note of those, just so that you've got a sense of what is the sort of writing at the time. So exploring the context. I'm going to give you just a few minutes now to do a little bit of research. You'll notice there is a YouTube link there to a short documentary. I think it's about 7 minutes long, which you can watch. Do a bit of research on your computer, see what you can find out about John Donne's writing. He wrote a collection which was called Songs and Sonnets, which were love poems, and they actually varied an awful lot. So you actually got the very sexually forward poems like The Flea, but you also got some other sort of focus on love and relationships through that. You notice sonnets is spelt with one N. That's just because of language change. The spelling has changed over time, and most of these poems, I think all of the poems, are actually from a male poetic voice, often sort of reflecting that more misogynistic ideology of the time that he was writing. So again, pause the tutorial here so that you can just do a little bit of research, have a look at that YouTube link. Okay, moving on to Phillip Larkin now. He was born in Coventry, had a number of collections. One is called Wits and Weddings, which is taught on A-level courses. He admired Thomas Hardy's poetry, so you will have come across a couple of Hardy's poems in the anthology if you do AQA. And the idea being that he looks at kind of the starkness of human relationships. Reference there is tough, memorable, unsparing poems. So he was a prominent poet of his generation, and he became a leading voice of the movement, which was a poetic movement that actually rejected these more sort of fanciful writings of some poems and poets into something that was just about personal emotion, but without that kind of flowery sentimentality that you might see with some of the romantic poets. Okay, so there's a couple of links there. There's a YouTube link there and some useful information from the poetryfoundation.org. I would just have a pause of the tutorial here and see what you can find about Phillip Larkin and take some notes. All right, number 4 then is you've got all of that. It seems like we've taken a long time. Obviously, when you're in the exam, you won't have access to the internet. You will have needed to revise these notes. That's the thing with unseen poetry. It's not just a point of where you can just go, right, I'm just going to analyse these 2 poems. You have to place them in their time in history. You have to understand how they are dealing with issues of the time. You can see now just have a go at doing some poetry annotations. You can see I've got some fairly simple ones that I've put on this slide for you. Just write on the poems that are printed in the exam paper. I usually suggest using the textual attractors approach, or the don't worry about what you don't spot, just about what you do approach. In other words, just read it, pick out what stands out to you. But also thinking too about the sort of the form of the poetry. How does this fit with the poetry of its time? So John Donne, we know in The Flea, had a conceit running through all the way through it. Is there a conceit here? I would argue that there is. This extended sort of metaphor, this extended idea of the ghost. But again, you can differ with that if you want to. But this is your time now to spend annotating both poems. So you've got some there for the apparition. If you want to help yourself by looking online, you can do so now. There's a number of different YouTube tutorials that you will be able to find. And also, I think Genius sometimes has some quite good stuff and quite good annotations, as well as other sort of commentary sites that you might find. So again, pause the tutorial here and you'll be able to have a look and focus on those annotations. Okay, so once your annotations, you've got that, you'll be in a position now to go back to that question and ask, is Donne's poem about the pain of rejection and Larkin's about love failing to live up to expectations? Or actually, is there more going on than this? Now, this is where you build your argument. For my students, you'll know that we tend to look in terms of a thesis and antithesis. So what is your main thinking around this, but are there any challenges to it? That's what we're thinking about in terms of an argument. So what I do, and again, my students will know this, we do this quite often, is we turn this into some form of question or a statement about whether one is about the pain of rejection and one is about failing to live up to expectations. You can see here I've kind of put it into a statement, but I have put that question mark at the end. Let's ask questions of these texts. Donne's poem is about the pain of rejection. Larkin's about love failing to live up to expectations. Question mark. But are they really? Now, what I do, as you can see, step 5 in our yellow box is build your thesis and antithesis. We use this continuum scale. And you place yourself onto that continuum scale as to where you agree and disagree. So I'll just give you a minute to do that now before I move on. Just have a think about everything we've looked at, have a think about your annotations, and then just perhaps put a cross on that continuum scale where you feel you would sit regarding this statement. Okay, so hopefully you've done that. I'm just going to show you again that continuum and show you where I would place myself. Now, I think I've probably been quite surprising about this. I don't know whether a lot of you have decided you do agree with it. I'm actually, and it's unusual for me, just moving towards that disagree line, point on the line. Because I don't know whether these are about this. I mean, certainly Donne's poem is. But is Larkin's about love failing to live up to expectations? Maybe. I guess possibly. In terms of sort of, going back to my ideas about this intensity of love that we expect to experience in modern times, perhaps it does fail to live up to expectations. But I think there's a lot more to Larkin's poem than that. The good thing about unseen poetry is that as long as you can back up your ideas and you can back up your arguments, it probably doesn't matter that much. So remember this argument, this thesis and this antithesis, can't say that word, will help you to form your introduction to your essay later on. So I've put what I think, I'm not sure I agree with this in terms of the Larkin, because I think he's quite realistic about love. He celebrates that we don't always get the fairy tale. The love that occurs outside the cliche of love at first sight is often the one that endures. So he fancied one woman, but went with the one he could talk to. Maybe this is the idea of true love that Shakespeare talks about in Sonnet 116, for instance. However, what you could argue is, and there's a line in the poem, isn't there, that suggests that he gave that ring back, that even though the one he could talk to was the one that the love lasted for longer, actually, he still gave the ring back. So there came a time when it felt right to end that relationship. I think this reflects a very, quite a modern view of love. In fact, it's probably before his time when the poem was written. But this idea, again, this confluent love, that we are serial monogamists. That means we have one partner, but we have more than one partner in our life, and we leave one and move on to the next. The other thing is I can't totally disagree. So I haven't placed myself, I just get my cursor. You can see we're now looking at the antithesis, which tends to be the smaller element, the alternative smaller element of that sliding scale there, is that Donne clearly is about the pain of rejection. So the apparition is about him feeling pain and hurt. But it's from a male perspective. The persona is a man. And I can't get out of my head this sort of misogynistic time that perhaps this is more about hurt feelings and anger. I mean, the poem itself is very bitter and very angry towards the woman that it's referring to. And I can't help feeling that this is actually about hurt pride. For those of you who study Othello, for example, you could argue that Iago's focus on love and his focus on revenge is actually because of hurt pride, because he thought that Othello possibly had slept with his wife. So there's all sorts of things that are actually built up in this. And again, I'm hoping what you'll see here is that you've got a whole picture that you need to build up before you start writing an essay about these poems. Otherwise, what you will do is you'll probably end up doing a fairly feature spotty, it's not a word, analysis of the language features, but forget about the holistic kind of approach to literature, which is all based upon historicism. Okay, finally, I'm just going to finish off here now. There are some other bits and pieces of summary, which I'll show you in a moment on this PowerPoint. But do try to make sure if you're studying AQA literature that you are actually covering AO1 to AO5, that you're engaging in debates, that you're talking about the text and the time they're written, that you're looking at that typicality and linking them to the sorts of literature that might have been around at the time, as well as employing sort of context, so that your messages for your AO2 and your academic analysis for your AO1 all structured around that argument for the thesis statement. All of these actually build a rounded response that covers the AOs. Remembering for AQA, AO1 to 3 are the more dominant criteria. Okay. Just to finish off now, I'm just going to flick through the rest of the PowerPoint, just so that you've got that, especially if you're only working on the PowerPoint now and you don't have it in front of you. So here is a plan for the essay. Honestly, people change these. You can see I've got a focus on PEASL, which is point, evidence, zoom, explore, link back to the question. My advice really is, if you can do this in a much more fluid way, with your analysis, it's probably going to be more impressive. But if you do need to work on a structure for each point, then you could use that PESEL analysis to start you off, trying to sort of lose that as you develop your confidence. Again, this might change. You can change this around. Examiners aren't saying that you have to include all of this. But you'll notice here on this slide, I have actually put in red little mini conclusions. So after each point you make, that L of the PESEL, I suppose, is make sure you are linking back through to your thesis and your antithesis, your argument based on that statement. And that will then keep you focused on the argument. And when you get to your conclusion, remembering your introduction and your conclusion should top and tail your essay. You can draw those strands of your argument from your mini conclusions together. Finally, there's just a summary there of the sort of structure to planning through from your starting point through to 4 there. Feel free to take a screen print if you wanted to save that. And then finally up to writing this up. Simply put, look at your question and your argument first, develop detailed annotations for the AOs, and then write up using that planning. Students who don't plan don't do very well. So do make sure that you use some of these features. Okay, and thank you very much.